Even with New York's complicated history as a port for new arrival, the photograph this summer of more than 100 migrants sleeping shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalk outside the once elegant Roosevelt Hotel in Midtown Manhattan was shocking. So were scenes of young migrants idling on sidewalk, stoops, and parked benches, desperate to work but legally prohibited from doing so. For those of us who were once part of such a moment, the scenes stirred up memories and reflections on how different some things were now for new arrivals and how much they were the same. I too was once part of a migrant influx. In the years after the end of World War II, New York City observed a similar wave of immigrants. A large majority of the 140,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors who came to America between 1946 and 1953 and did so comparatively smoothly and uneventfully. These migrants were eager to get on with their lives, but were still in shock or heartbroken from the brutalities they had suffered, the parents and the siblings they had lost, and the hometowns they could no longer return to. Those who had no relatives to stay with were up in 14 hotels that had seen better days, as well as in a shelter hacked out of the former Astor Library on Lafayette Street, which is now the Public Theater. My family was among those immigrants, having spent the previous 4 years waiting for visas to the United States, while idling in 2 camps for so-called displaced person in the American zone in occupied Germany. After a rocky voyage on new vessel called the USS General A.W. Greeley, my parents, my brothers, and I arrived on March 3, 1950, at a pier on West 21st Street. My brother Joshua was not yet 3, I was 5. Since it was a festive holiday of Purim, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society greeted us with Haman Sachin and the copy, and then our valises and duffel bags were piled into a van, and we were taken to Capitol Hall on West 87th Street up Amsterdam Avenue. Unlike the more than 130,000 migrants who have arrived in New York since the spring of 2022, we immigrated in comparatively programmed fashion. Our entry was sanctioned by a 1950 amendment to the 1948 Displaced Persons Act, intended to admit tens of thousands of concentration camp survivors and other people whose homes and villages had been destroyed by the Nazi extermination campaign, or who feared retribution from the Soviet authorities for opposing communist governments in Eastern Europe. The fact that we were admitted into the United States did not mean that we entered in entirely kosher fashion. It was somewhat problematic. Then my parents had survived the war in the Soviet Union. My father as a Polish draftee into the Soviet Army. My mother by sleeping out of the Nazi occupation of Warsaw. They met in a factory town in the Ural Mountains. where they married and where I was born in January 1945. After the war, they and the brother of my mother's were the sole survivors of what had been two large families. Their hometowns' Jewish communities had been almost completely wiped out. Like many Jews, they considered migrating to the new nation of Israel, but my father worried about another outbreak of fighting there and chose to wait for America to open its doors to the refugees. Because of the burgeoning fever of anti-communism that would culminate with the McCarthy era, my parents feared that if they declared their true whereabouts during the war, they would be denied entry. So, like tens of thousands of others who had found refuge from the Nazis in the miserable depths of the Soviet Union, they destroyed any authentic documents and made up tales of survival. They told the American authorities and us, their children, that they had spent the war years hiding in Poland. They did not reveal the true story to me until I was in my early 20s and realized that aspect of their original story did not jive.